The gunshot echoed across Sweetwater Creek like a clap of thunder, sending a flock of startled birds into the crimson horizon as Delilah Vaughn ducked behind the general store, her heart pounding against her ribs. 10 years had passed since she'd last set foot in Prominence, Wyoming territory, and she certainly hadn't planned on announcing her return with gunfire. It was 1876, the nation's centennial year, though there was little celebration to be found in this dusty corner of the frontier. The town had grown since she'd left, sprouting new buildings and businesses along its main street. But the essence remained unchanged, the same golden dust that clung to everything, the same relentless sun beating down on weathered facades. "I believe you dropped this, madam," came a low, graveled voice from behind her. Delilah whirled around, nearly colliding with a broad chest covered in a faded blue shirt. Her eyes traveled upward, past the worn leather vest, past the shadow of stubble on a strong jaw, until they met a pair of storm-gray eyes she would have recognized in her darkest nightmares. Drew Daniels, the man who had once promised her the world, only to let her walk away from it. In his outstretched hand lay her handkerchief, embroidered with the delicate violets her grandmother had stitched before Delilah had fled east a decade ago. The same handkerchief she'd pressed into his palm the night she'd told him she was leaving. "I never stopped loving you," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the commotion from the street. The world seemed to stop around them, the sounds of horses and commerce fading into a distant hum. Delilah felt her throat constrict, a decade of carefully constructed walls threatening to crumble with 5 simple words. "You had your chance, Drew," she finally managed, snatching the handkerchief from his hand. "I'm only passing through." But as she stepped away, another gunshot rang out, and the lie she'd just spoken would soon become the least of her concerns. Delilah had come back to Prominence with a purpose to sell her late father's ranch and return to Philadelphia, where she'd built a respectable life teaching at a girls' school. Simple, straightforward. Yet nothing about the West had ever been simple, and as Drew pulled her behind the shelter of a water trough while bullets splintered the wood above them, she realized her carefully laid plans were already unraveling. "Ward's gang," Drew explained, his breath warm against her ear as he crouched protectively beside her. "They've been terrorizing the territory for months now." "What do they want?" Delilah asked, flinching as another shot struck nearby. "Everything they can take," Drew replied grimly, "including the Vaughn Ranch. Her father's property, 5,000 acres of prime grazing land with natural springs that never ran dry, even in the harshest summers. For years, Jacob Vaughn had refused to sell to cattle barons who coveted his water rights. Now he was gone, and his stubborn nature seemed to have bequeathed Delilah more than just land. "I need to get to Sheriff Harrison," Delilah said, gathering her skirts to make a run for it. Drew's hand closed around her wrist, his calloused fingers gentle yet firm. "Harrison's been in Ward's pocket for months. That's why I gave up the badge." The revelation stunned her. Drew had been deputy when she left, his dedication to justice as much a part of him as his skill with horses. In her mind, he'd become the sheriff by now, married to some suitable frontier woman who could give him what Delilah couldn't, a life rooted in the rugged landscape she'd been so desperate to escape. "You were the deputy?" she asked, focusing on the safer part of his statement. "Sheriff," he corrected. "For 7 years. Until I couldn't stomach the corruption anymore." The shooting had stopped, and an eerie quiet settled over the street. Drew peered cautiously around the edge of the trough. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he said. "They know you're back, and they'll be watching the trails to your father's place." "How did they even know I was coming?" Delilah asked, brushing dust from her traveling dress, an elegant garment that now seemed ridiculous against the backdrop of frontier violence. Drew's expression darkened. "Telegraph operator likely tipped them off when your message about Jacob's funeral came through." A lump formed in Delilah's throat. She'd missed her father's burial, arriving 3 days too late due to delays on the railroad. Another regret to add to the mountain she'd accumulated over the years. "I have a wagon behind the livery," Drew said, offering his hand to help her up. "We can take the back routes to my cabin until we figure out our next move." "Our next move," Delilah repeated, ignoring his outstretched hand and standing on her own. "There is no hour, Drew." "There hasn't been for a long time." Pain flashed across his features, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Then consider me an escort to your property, Miss Vaughn. These men won't hesitate to hurt you to get what they want. The formality stung more than it should have. Miss Vaughn, as if they were strangers. As if he hadn't once whispered her name against her skin like a prayer. Fine, she conceded. But I'm selling the ranch and leaving as soon as possible. Drew nodded, his expression unreadable as he led her through a narrow alley behind the shops. Your father's lawyer might have something to say about that. Jacob changed his will before he died. Delilah stopped short. What are you talking about? The will stipulates you must live on the property for 6 months before you can sell, Drew explained, checking both directions before guiding her across an open space between buildings. He wanted you to understand what you'd be giving up. Anger and grief surged through her in equal measure. Even from the grave, her father was trying to control her future. That's absurd. I have obligations back east. Students expecting me for the fall term. I don't make the rules, Delilah, Drew said, his use of her given name sending an unwelcome shiver down her spine. But I do know that if you walk away now, Ward will find a way to take everything your father built. They reached the livery stable without further incident. Drew's wagon was modest but well-maintained, loaded with supplies and covered with a canvas tarp. He helped her up to the seat despite her reluctance, his hands lingering no longer than propriety allowed. As they left Prominence behind, following a winding trail through scrubby pine and sage, Delilah studied the man beside her from the corner of her eye. The years had weathered him, lines etching the corners of his eyes and mouth, a small scar bisecting his right eyebrow that hadn't been there before. His shoulders seemed broader, his presence more commanding, though he'd always carried himself with quiet confidence. You never married, she observed, the words escaping before she could stop them. Drew kept his eyes on the trail. Neither did you. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. No. Why? He asked after a long silence. Delilah turned to look at the landscape rolling past, the familiar mountains rising in the distance. My work kept me busy. Teaching suits you, he said. You always had a way of making people see things they couldn't before. The simple observation, so genuine and free of bitterness, threatened to undo her. How many nights had she lain awake in her narrow Philadelphia bed, wondering if she'd made the right choice? How many times had she drafted letters that were never sent, apologies that withered on the page? Why did you keep it? She asked suddenly. The handkerchief. Drew's hands tightened on the reins. Some things you just can't let go of, no matter how hard you try. The wagon crested a hill, revealing a valley bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Nestled against a stand of cottonwoods sat a modest cabin, smoke curling from its chimney. Someone's there, Delilah said, alarmed. Drew nodded. My sister, Hannah. She's been keeping house for me since our mother passed 2 winters ago. Another piece of news Delilah had missed. Drew's mother, Eleanor, had been kind to her, teaching her to bake bread and preserve vegetables when Delilah's own mother had been too consumed by illness to pass on such knowledge. I'm sorry, she said softly. Your mother was a good woman. She asked about you, near the end, Drew said, his voice tight. Wanted to know if I'd heard anything. Guilt twisted in Delilah's stomach. I should have written. Yes, Drew agreed simply. You should have. The cabin door opened as they approached, and a slender young woman with Drew's coloring stepped onto the porch. Hannah had been just 13 when Delilah left, a gangly girl with ink-stained fingers and a passion for dime novels. Now she stood tall and composed, her dark hair neatly pinned, though Delilah could still see traces of that curious girl in her bright eyes. Delilah Vaughn, Hannah said, her tone guarded but not unwelcoming. The prodigal daughter returns. Hannah, Drew cautioned, helping Delilah down from the wagon. It's all right, Delilah assured him. I deserve worse. Hannah's expression softened slightly. Come inside. You look like you could use some coffee and a wash basin. I'll find you something more practical to wear than that city finery. The cabin's interior was modest but comfortable, a testament to the Daniels siblings' practical nature. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, bookshelves filled with volumes Delilah recognized from Drew's collection lining another. Simple furnishings, well crafted and cared for, created a home far more inviting than the cold elegance of her Philadelphia boarding house. Ward's men came by earlier, Hannah said as she poured coffee into tin cups, asking questions about Delilah's arrival. Drew's jaw tightened. What did you tell them? That I hadn't heard she was coming back, Hannah replied. Which was the truth, since someone didn't think to mention it. She shot her brother a pointed look. I only found out myself when I saw her in town, Drew explained, accepting a cup from his sister. Delilah wrapped her hands around the warm tin, drawing comfort from its heat. I should have sent word ahead, but I wasn't sure I'd be welcome. You're Jacob Vaughn's daughter, Hannah said matter-of-factly. Whatever else you might be, that still means something in these parts. The simple acknowledgement of her identity, her true identity, not the carefully constructed persona she'd adopted in the East, shook Delilah more than she cared to admit. For years, she'd been Miss Vaughn, the composed, educated teacher who spoke proper English and wore fashionable clothes. Here, she was Jacob's girl, the motherless child who'd learned to ride before she could read, who knew the rhythm of the seasons and the language of the land. I don't know if I can stay 6 months, she confessed, staring into her coffee. I have a life back east. And your father had a life here, Drew said quietly. One he built for you. Delilah looked up sharply. He built it for himself. I was just expected to fall in line with his plans. Is that why you left? Hannah asked, her directness reminiscent of her mother. Because of Jacob? The question hung in the air, charged with a decade of unspoken truths. Delilah's gaze drifted to Drew, finding his eyes already on her, waiting. I left because I was suffocating, she finally admitted. Because I couldn't see a future here that wasn't already mapped out for me. Marry, have children, work the land until it broke me like it broke my mother. And was that the only future you couldn't accept? Drew asked, his voice low. Or was it the one I offered that sent you running? Hannah cleared her throat. I think I'll check on the horses, she said, slipping outside with tactful efficiency. Alone with Drew, Delilah felt the weight of their shared history pressing down on her. The last time they'd been alone together had been the night before her departure, when he'd proposed with his grandmother's ring and promised they could build something different from their parents' hardscrabble existence. You asked me to choose, she said finally, between my dreams and yours. Drew set down his cup with deliberate care. I asked you to share a dream with me. There's a difference. You wanted me to stay when everything in me was screaming to go, Delilah countered. To see something beyond these mountains, to be someone other than Jacob Vaughn's daughter or Drew Daniels' wife. And did you find her? Drew asked, his gaze unwavering. This other self you were looking for? The question cut to the heart of everything Delilah had been avoiding since the moment she'd stepped off the train. Had she found fulfillment in the ordered rows of desks, the neat columns of grades, the polite conversations at faculty teas? Had independence given her the freedom she'd craved, or simply a different kind of confinement? I found parts of her, she answered honestly. But I lost others. Drew nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he'd long suspected. Your room's through there, he said, indicating a door off the main living area. Hannah's laid out some clothes. We should reach your father's place by midday tomorrow if we leave at first light. Delilah recognized the dismissal for what it was, not anger, but self-preservation. Drew had spent 10 years rebuilding his life without her. He wouldn't tear down those walls for a woman who'd made it clear she was just passing through. As night fell, Delilah lay in the narrow bed that smelled faintly of cedar and soap, listening to the unfamiliar symphony of prairie sounds. Crickets and night birds called to one another. The wind whispered through cottonwood leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote's lonesome howl rose to meet the stars. Sounds she'd once known as well as her own heartbeat, forgotten in the clamor of city life. Morning came with streaks of pink and gold across an endless sky. Delilah dressed in the clothes Hannah had provided, a simple skirt and shirtwaist, sturdy boots, and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her face from the sun. Practical garments for a practical land. When she emerged from the bedroom, Drew was already loading the wagon, his movements efficient and purposeful. I made biscuits, Hannah said, pushing a plate toward her. And there's coffee in the pot. The simple hospitality, offered without reservation despite their complicated history, humbled Delilah. Thank you, she said, accepting the food gratefully. For everything. Hannah studied her for a moment. He's never gotten over you, you know. Tried to, God knows. There have been women who would have given anything for him to look at them the way he looked at you. But he couldn't do it. I never asked him to wait, Delilah said softly. No, Hannah agreed. You just assumed he wouldn't. Before Delilah could respond, Drew entered the cabin. "We should get moving," he said, his expression carefully neutral. "Ward's men will be watching the main road to your place, so we'll take the old hunting trails. It'll be slower, but safer." The journey to the Vaughn ranch passed in relative silence, broken only by Drew's occasional comments about changes to the landscape or warnings about rough terrain ahead. As they traveled, Delilah began to recognize landmarks from her childhood: the lightning-struck pine, where she'd once found an eagle's feather, the rock formation shaped like a sleeping bear, the creek where she'd learned to swim on sweltering summer days. And then, cresting a gentle rise, the Vaughn homestead came into view. The main house stood much as she remembered it, a sturdy two-story structure built from local timber and stone. The barn needed painting, the corral fence sagged in places, and the garden her mother had once tended with such care had gone wild. But the bones of the place remained strong. "Your father kept everything running," Drew said, following her gaze. "Hired good men, made improvements to the irrigation system. The drought 2 years back hit him hard, but he recovered better than most." "Why did Ward wait until now to make his move?" Delilah asked as they approached. "The railroad," Drew explained. "They're surveying for a new line that would cut through the southeast corner of your property. Land that was worth something before is worth 10 times more now." Understanding dawned. "And my father refused to sell." Drew nodded. "Till his dying day. Said he'd promised your mother the land would stay in the family." The mention of her mother sent a pang through Delilah's heart. Catherine Vaughn had been a gentle soul, ill-suited to the harsh realities of frontier life. She died when Delilah was 16, worn down by the elements and isolation, leaving behind a daughter who'd vowed never to meet the same fate. As they pulled up to the house, the front door opened, and a weathered man with a shotgun stepped onto the porch. His suspicious expression melted into one of recognition and relief. "Miss Delilah," he called, lowering his weapon. "Praise be, you made it safe." "Hank Porter," Drew explained, seeing her confusion. "Your father's foreman for the past 8 years. Good man." Hank approached the wagon, hat in hand. "Been worried sick since we got word you were in town. Ward's boys have been sniffing around like hungry wolves." Drew explained the situation, Delilah said, accepting his help down from the wagon. "And about my father's will." Hank nodded solemnly. "Mr. Vaughn was set on you knowing what you'd be giving up if you sold. Said you never gave the place a fair chance before you left." The accusation, though gently delivered, stung with its truth. She'd been so determined to escape that she'd never truly appreciated what her father had built: not just a ranch, but a legacy, a place where generations of Vaughns could put down roots and thrive. "The house is all ready for you," Hank continued. "Mrs. Porter's been keeping it clean, just in case." Delilah remembered Hank's wife, Martha, a capable woman with a talent for herbal remedies who'd helped care for Catherine during her final illness. "That was kind of her. Least we could do," Hank said. "Your father was good to us. Fair when others weren't." As they walked toward the house, Delilah noticed Drew hanging back. "You're not coming in?" she asked, surprised by her own disappointment. "Best I get back," he said. "Hannah's alone, and Ward's men might come sniffing around again." "Drew," she began, uncertain what she wanted to say, but knowing she couldn't let him leave like this. "I'll check on you in a few days," he promised. "Make sure everything's settled." With that, he turned the wagon and headed back the way they'd come, leaving Delilah standing in the yard of her childhood home, feeling more lost than she had on any Philadelphia street. The next weeks passed in a blur of rediscovery. Delilah found her father's ledgers meticulously kept, the ranch operations more prosperous than she'd imagined possible in this unforgiving land. Hank proved an invaluable guide, patiently explaining changes and improvements, introducing her to the hands who worked the property with obvious respect for the Vaughn name. Martha Porter brought fresh bread and preserves, along with local gossip and gentle inquiries about Delilah's life in the East. Their conversations, initially stilted, gradually warmed as Delilah shed the formal mannerisms she'd adopted in Philadelphia and rediscovered the more direct communication of the frontier. Through it all, she waited for Drew to return as promised. When a week passed with no sign of him, she told herself it was for the best. When 2 weeks stretched into 3, she convinced herself she was relieved. By the 4th week, she admitted the truth: she missed him. missed the quiet strength of his presence, the way he listened more than he spoke, the occasional flash of dry humor that revealed itself in the quirk of his lips or the arch of an eyebrow. Then came the letter, delivered by a ranch hand returning from town. Hannah's neat handwriting informed her that Drew had gone to Cheyenne on business and would be delayed in his return. The letter was polite, impersonal, revealing nothing of the conversation they'd had the morning Delilah left the Daniels cabin. That night, unable to sleep, Delilah stood on the porch of her father's house, her house now, and watched a summer storm roll across the prairie. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes, revealing the beauty and danger that coexisted in this untamed place. Like memory, she thought, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. The following morning, determined to shake off her melancholy, Delilah decided to ride the property boundaries, something her father had done weekly without fail. Martha Porter had unearthed a pair of riding trousers that had scandalized Philadelphia society, but were eminently practical for a woman on horseback. Mounting a gentle mare Hank assured her would give no trouble, Delilah set out to reacquaint herself with the land of her birth. The vastness of it struck her in new miles of rolling grassland, patches of forest, streams cutting silver paths through meadows bright with wildflowers. In Philadelphia, she'd felt hemmed in by buildings and social expectations, every movement observed and judged. Here, the only judgment came from the hawks circling overhead, the only expectation that she respect the land's power and beauty. As she rode along the creek that marked the eastern boundary, a flash of movement caught her eye. A rider, moving fast across her property, headed toward the line shack her father had built for hands caught out in bad weather. Instinctively, Delilah urged her horse into a thicket of trees, watching as the figure approached. Even at a distance, she recognized Drew's posture in the saddle, the way he moved in rhythm with his mount as if they were a single entity. But something was wrong. He was slumped forward, one hand pressed to his side, the other white-knuckled on the reins. Hard in her throat, Delilah broke cover, spurring her horse toward him. Drew! He looked up at her call, his face alarmingly pale beneath the tan. Delilah, he managed, before swaying dangerously in the saddle. She reached him just as he began to slide sideways, somehow managing to slow his fall enough that he didn't hit the ground with full force. Dismounting quickly, she knelt beside him, her hands hovering uncertainly until she saw the dark stains spreading across his shirt. "What happened?" she demanded, gently pulling the fabric away to reveal a deep gash along his ribs. "Ward's men," Drew said through gritted teeth. "Ambushed me on the way back from Cheyenne. Didn't want the papers I was carrying to reach you." "What papers?" Delilah asked, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against the wound. Drew reached inside his jacket with trembling fingers, producing a folded document. "Proof that Sheriff Harrison has been taking bribes to ignore Ward's illegal activities. Enough to get the territorial governor involved." Delilah tucked the papers safely into her shirt. "We need to get you to the line shack," she said. "Can you ride?" Drew nodded, though the effort clearly cost him. "Not the first time I've been cut up." With considerable effort, they managed to get him back on his horse. Delilah led both animals at a careful pace, acutely aware of every groan or hiss of pain from the man behind her. By the time they reached the small cabin, Drew's face had taken on a gray cast that frightened her more than the blood. The line shack was simple but clean, stocked with basic provisions and medical supplies. Delilah helped Drew to the narrow cot, then set about gathering what she needed to treat his wound. "Your father taught you well," Drew observed as she efficiently prepared a basin of hot water and laid out bandages. "My mother, actually," Delilah corrected, helping him remove his shirt to better access the injury. She believed every woman should know how to tend wounds, even proper Philadelphia ladies. The gash was ugly but not as deep as she'd feared. Still, it would need stitching to heal properly. "This will hurt," she warned, threading a needle with steady hands. Drew managed a weak smile. "I trust you." The simple declaration, spoken without hesitation, pierced her more deeply than any needle could. As she worked, Delilah found herself talking to distract them both from the grim task. "I've been riding the property every day," she said, carefully drawing the edges of the wound together. "Relearning its rhythms. It's changed, but somehow exactly the same." "Like you," Drew murmured, his eyes never leaving her face despite the pain he must be feeling. Delilah's hands stilled momentarily. "I'm not the same girl who left, Drew." "I know," he replied. "You're stronger, more certain, but your heart that hasn't changed." She resumed her work, unwilling to meet his gaze. "How would you know? You haven't been inside my heart for 10 years. Haven't I?" he asked softly. The question hung between them as she finished the last stitch and covered the wound with a clean bandage. When she finally looked up, Drew's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Exhaustion and blood loss had claimed him for now, sparing her the need to answer. As night fell, Delilah built up the fire and prepared a simple meal from the shack stores. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, pattering against the roof and windows in a soothing rhythm. She checked Drew's forehead for fever, relieved to find his skin cool to the touch. His eyes fluttered open at her touch. "How long was I out?" "A few hours," she said, helping him sit up enough to drink some water. "The wound's clean." No sign of infection yet. Drew took the cup from her hands, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Thank you. You should eat something," Delilah said, moving away to fetch the stew she'd prepared. "Delilah," Drew said, his voice stopping her retreat. "Why did you really leave?" She turned back slowly, finding him watching her with an intensity that made prevarication impossible. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Not of the life, not really. Of how much I wanted it with you. Of disappearing into us until there was nothing left that was just mine." Drew considered this, his expression thoughtful rather than hurt. "And now? What are you afraid of now?" "That it's too late," she whispered, the truth finally breaking free after a decade of denial. "That I threw away something precious for a freedom that turned out to be just another kind of cage." Drew set aside the water cup and held out his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Delilah took it, allowing him to draw her down beside him on the edge of the cot. "When you left," he began, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, "I thought it was because I wasn't enough. That what I could offer wasn't grand enough for someone like you." "No," Delilah protested. "It was never that." "I know that now," Drew said. "But it took me years to understand that your leaving wasn't about rejection. It was about finding yourself. And I've hurt you terribly in the process," she said, tears threatening. Drew reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch achingly gentle. "We've both done some growing up since then. Maybe enough to try again, if that's something you might want." Delilah closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the possibility he was offering. "The ranch needs someone who knows what they're doing," she said, opening her eyes to find him watching her with cautious hope. "Someone who understands the land. And I find I'm not as eager to return east as I expected to be." "Is that a roundabout way of asking for my help, Miss Vaughn?" Drew asked, a hint of his old, teasing smile emerging. "It's a roundabout way of saying I still love you, Drew Daniels," Delilah answered, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "I never stopped, not really. I just buried it under pride and distance and fear." The smile that transformed Drew's face was worth every mile she'd traveled, every year of separation, every tear shed in lonely rooms far from home. "Well," he said, pulling her closer despite his injury, "that makes two of us." Their kiss was gentle, mindful of his wound, but filled with a decade of longing finally fulfilled. When they parted, Delilah rested her forehead against his, breathing in the scent that had haunted her dreams, leather and pine and something uniquely Drew. "We still have war to deal with," she reminded him. "And I have obligations to settle in Philadelphia." "One challenge at a time," Drew said, pressing another kiss to her temple. Together, the simple word held a world of promise, not the end of her independence, but the beginning of a partnership. Two people choosing each other, day after day, through whatever the frontier might throw at them. 3 days later, when Drew was strong enough to travel, they returned to the main house to find Hank Porter and a group of neighboring ranchers gathered in the yard. News of the ambush had spread, along with the revelation of Sheriff Harrison's corruption. The territorial governor had dispatched federal marshals, who had arrested both Harrison and Ward the previous day. "Your father would be proud," Martha Porter told Delilah as they watched Drew speaking with the gathered men. "Not just of saving the ranch, but of finding your way back to what matters." "I'm not sure I deserve it," Delilah confessed. "This second chance." Martha's weathered hand covered hers. "Deserving has nothing to do with love, child. It's about recognizing it when it's offered and being brave enough to accept it. In the weeks that followed, Delilah wrote to the school in Philadelphia, recommending a replacement for her position and arranging for her few possessions to be sent west. Drew recovered fully from his wound, dividing his time between his own small ranch and the Vaughn property, teaching Delilah the management skills she'd need to fulfill her father's wishes. On a crisp autumn evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over land that would now remain in Vaughn hands for another generation, Drew took her hand and slipped a ring onto her finger, the same ring she'd refused a decade earlier. "I kept this too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Some things you hold on to, even when there's no rational reason for hope." Delilah looked down at the simple gold band with its small pearl, then back at the man beside her, the boy she'd loved, the man she'd left, the soul she'd somehow found her way back to despite all odds. "I think," she said, leaning into his embrace, "that hope is the most rational thing in the world." It brought me home. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Delilah Vaughn finally understood what her father had wanted her to learn. It wasn't about the land itself, though its beauty and promise were undeniable. It was about putting down roots deep enough to weather any storm, about building something that would endure beyond a single lifetime. It was about finding someone to share the journey, through hardship and joy alike. With Drew's arm around her and the vast Wyoming sky spread out above them, Delilah was no longer running from the past or toward the future. For the first time in her life, she was simply, perfectly, present exactly where she was meant to be.